The letter from the bank arrived on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were the days my grandfather used to drive into town for feed, and I'd taken over that habit without thinking about it. The way you inherit a man's routines long before you inherit anything else. The envelope was thin. That's how you know it's bad news. The thick ones have paperwork, options, things to sign. The thin ones just have a number and a deadline. $97,000. That's what I owed, spread across 3 lines of credit, a second mortgage, and the equipment loan for a combine that hadn't turned a profit in 3 seasons. $97,000 on a farm that was barely worth twice that, in a county where land prices had been sinking like a stone in a stock pond. I set the letter on the kitchen counter next to the coffee maker and didn't say a word. My name is Ethan Miller. I'm 46 years old. I've been farming this ground in central Iowa since I was 22, when my father handed me the keys to the barn and said, "It's yours now. Don't let it beat you." He died of a heart attack 4 years later, standing in the middle of the south field with a wrench in his hand. I sometimes think the land took him the way it takes everything. Slowly at first, then all at once. 3 bad harvests in a row. That's all it takes. 3 summers of too much rain or not enough. 3 autumns of watching grain prices drop on a screen while your bins sit full of corn nobody wants at the price you need. The first bad year, you dip into savings. The second, you borrow. The third, you start looking at the classifieds and wondering what a man who's only ever known dirt and diesel can do in an office park somewhere. My wife, Sarah, had stopped asking how we were doing. She could read it on my face every evening when I came inside, smelling of sweat and rust. Our kids were 12 and 14, old enough to understand that something was wrong, young enough to believe their father could fix it. I couldn't fix it. Not this time. That's when I decided to tear down my grandfather's old dairy barn. The barn sat at the back of the property, about 300 yards from the house, past the equipment shed and the grain bins and the rusted skeleton of a hay rake that nobody had used in 20 years. It was a beautiful structure once. Hand-hewn oak beams, a gambrel roof, stone foundation that my great-great-grandfather, Josiah Miller, had laid in 1889. But the roof had caved in during an ice storm in 2019, and by the time I got around to looking at it seriously, the whole thing was leaning like a tired man against the wind. The lumber, though, the lumber was good. Reclaimed barn wood was selling for $8, $10, $12 a board foot to those restoration companies out of Des Moines and Chicago. Hand-hewn oak, even more. I figured there was $15, maybe $20,000 worth of timber in that barn. If I could pull it apart carefully, stack it right, and find a buyer who wasn't going to lowball me. $20,000 wouldn't save the farm. But it might buy me 6 more months, and 6 months, when you're drowning, feels like a lifetime. I started on a Saturday in late September. The air smelled of cut alfalfa and the faintest trace of something burning. Someone clearing brush a few miles east. The smoke drifting low across the fields like a gray ghost. I brought a pry bar, a reciprocating saw, a thermos of coffee, and the kind of quiet determination that comes from having no other options. Sarah watched me from the kitchen window as I walked out there. She didn't wave. She'd told me the night before that I should be looking for a real job instead of playing demolition man with a building that should have come down years ago. She wasn't wrong. She was never wrong about the practical things. But I had to try. The first thing I noticed when I started pulling boards from the south wall was the smell. Under the dust and the mildew and the mouse droppings, there was something else, a sweetness, almost like old varnish or aged wood that had been sealed away from air and light for decades. My grandfather's dairy barn hadn't been used since 1987, when he sold his last Holstein and switched to row crops. But somewhere in the walls, you could still catch it. The ghost of warm milk and hay and animal heat. The smell of a working barn in winter. I pulled boards for 3 days, stacked them in the equipment shed, good straight oak, some of it nearly 140 years old, with the kind of grain patterns that made the restoration guys go quiet and start calculating. I was making progress. On the 4th day, I hit the concrete floor. The barn had 2 sections, the upper level where the hay was stored, and the lower level where the milking stalls had been. The lower level had a poured concrete floor, maybe 4 inches thick, cracked and stained from decades of use. I'd planned to leave it alone. There's no money in broken concrete. But as I was pulling the last of the wooden stall dividers, my pry bar caught on something. A seam. Not a crack. A seam. Deliberate. Straight. About 3 feet long, running along the base of the east wall where the floor met the foundation. I knelt down and brushed away the dirt with my hand. The concrete on one side of the seam was slightly different. Newer, maybe, or mixed at a different time. I pressed my thumb against the edge and felt it give, just slightly, like the lid of a jar that hadn't been opened in a long time. My heart started beating the way it does when you pull a fish line tight and feel the weight on the other end. I don't know why. It could have been anything. A pipe, an old drain, a repair someone had forgotten about. But something in my chest said, "Keep going." I went to the shed and got a sledgehammer. It took me 20 minutes to break through the concrete. Underneath was a cavity, maybe 2 feet deep, 3 feet wide, lined with old bricks that had been laid dry without mortar in a careful herringbone pattern. And sitting in the center of that cavity, wrapped in a heavy canvas tarp that had gone stiff with age, was a wooden crate. Not a box. A crate. The kind they used to ship things by rail. Thick pine planks, iron corner braces, the word fragile stenciled on the side in faded black letters. It was about the size of a large suitcase, heavy enough that I had to brace my legs to lift it out of the hole. I set it on the floor and just stared at it. Dust motes floated in the shaft of light from the broken roof above. A bird, a starling I think, fluttered somewhere in the rafters. The crate smelled like earth and pine resin and something else, something old and sweet, like the inside of a church. I pried the lid off with trembling hands. Inside the crate, each one wrapped individually in oilcloth that had gone dark with age, were 14 porcelain signs. Dairy signs, the kind that used to hang on barn walls or above creamery doors in the old days, advertising milk, butter, cheese, cream separators, breeding stock. They were hand-painted, each one different, each one a small work of art. Rich blues and reds and yellows on white porcelain, with images of cows and barns and rolling fields and farmers' hands. Some had lettering, Miller's Dairy, established 1889, and Pure Jersey Cream, and Grade A inspected. Others were purely decorative, landscapes and still lifes that belonged in a gallery, not on a barn wall. They were beautiful. Even through the grime and the years, even in the dim light of a half-demolished barn, they were startlingly, undeniably beautiful. But I didn't know that yet. Not really. Not the way you need to know something for it to matter. What I knew was this. There was also a leather journal in the crate. Small, about the size of a paperback novel, bound in dark brown leather that had gone soft with age. The pages inside were covered in tight, careful handwriting. The handwriting of Josiah Miller, My great-great-grandfather, dated between 1904 and 1922. I sat down on the concrete floor with my back against the foundation wall and started reading. The light was failing. That late September light that turns everything amber and makes every shadow look 100 years old. I could hear crickets starting up in the grass outside. Somewhere far off, a combine was running, the low hum of it carrying across the flat land the way sound does out here, traveling for miles with nothing to stop it. Sarah would be wondering where I was. The kids would be doing homework at the kitchen table, and dinner would be going cold on the stove. But I couldn't stop. I thought about my grandfather sitting in this same barn. He'd been a quiet man, my grandfather. He never talked much about the old days, about Josiah, about the dairy operation, about any of it. He'd just work. Every morning by 5, every evening until dark. Hands like leather gloves, permanently stained with grease and soil. I used to follow him around as a boy, handing him tools, watching him fix things with the kind of silent competence that made everything look easy. He never said, "I love you." He said, "Hand me the 3/8 wrench, and you did good today, boy." It meant the same thing. He died when I was 19, left the farm to my father, and my father left it to me, and none of us, not one of us, ever thought to look under the barn floor. Josiah's journal told the story of a traveling painter, a man named Abner Hollis. According to the journal, Hollis had first come through the area in the summer of 1904. He was a young man then, maybe 25, traveling the back roads of the Midwest with a wooden cart full of paints and brushes and sheets of porcelain he bought from a factory in Ohio. He went from farm to farm, offering to paint signs. Dairy signs mostly, since nearly every farm had a dairy operation in those days. He charged $3 a sign, sometimes less if the farmer was willing to feed him and let him sleep in the barn. Josiah had hired him, and something happened between the two men, a friendship, a mutual recognition of something. Josiah wrote that Hollis painted not like a sign maker, but like a man who sees the sacred in the ordinary. He described watching Hollis work, the way he mixed his colors, the way he'd stand back and squint at a half-finished piece the way a man might study a sunset, looking for something only he could see. Hollis came back, year after year. Sometimes he'd stay for a week, sometimes a month. He painted 14 signs for the Miller Dairy over a period of 18 years. Josiah commissioned each one personally, paid for each one out of his own pocket, and stored them carefully in the crate when they weren't being displayed. The later signs, the ones from 1918 to 1922, were more elaborate. Landscapes, portraits of individual cows, a winter scene of the barn at dusk that Josiah described as the finest picture I have ever seen produced by any hand. The last entry mentioning Hollis was from October 1922. Josiah wrote that the painter had left heading south toward Missouri, promising to return the following spring. He never did. Josiah sealed the crate and buried it under the barn floor in 1926. His entry simply said, "Stored the Hollis signs beneath the dairy floor for safekeeping. They are too fine to risk to weather or carelessness. Someone someday will know what they are worth." I closed the journal and sat there in the dark for a long time. Sarah's reaction was about what I expected. "Ethan, those are old signs, painted signs, from a barn. They're hand-painted porcelain. And there's a journal that... I don't care about a journal. I care about the mortgage. I care about the fact that we're 3 months behind on the truck payment. I care about the fact that our son needs braces and our daughter needs a winter coat." She was standing at the kitchen sink with her arms crossed, and the overhead light made her look tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. You spent 4 days tearing down a barn, and you came back with a box of dusty signs and a diary. That is not a plan. She was right. She was absolutely right. I stood there holding one of the signs, a blue and white image of a Jersey cow standing in a field of clover. So delicate and precise it looked like something from a dream. And I had no argument, no defense, just a feeling in my chest that wouldn't go away. I think they might be worth something, I said. Then take them to Dearborn's and find out. Dearborn's Antiques was a cluttered shop on Main Street run by a man named Ray Dearborn, who wore suspenders and a permanent expression of mild disappointment. I brought 3 of the signs in, still wrapped in their oilcloth. Ray looked at them the way a mechanic looks at a car he already knows isn't worth fixing. Porcelain signs, old ones, maybe 1910, 1920. He turned one over, checked the back, set it down. I'll give you $200 for the lot. For all 14. For all 14. They're decorative, nice enough. But the market for this stuff is thin. Collectors want enamel signs, brand name stuff, Coca-Cola, John Deere, Standard Oil. Nobody's looking for hand-painted dairy signs from a farm nobody's heard of. I should have taken the money. $200 was $200, and we needed every cent. But something, the journal maybe, or the way the blue in that clover field seemed to glow, even under the fluorescent lights of Ray Dearborn's shop, made me say no. I wrapped the signs back up and carried them home. The neighbors found out, of course. In a town that small, everything is known within 48 hours. Dale Perkins, who farmed the section north of mine, stopped me at the gas station. Heard you found some old signs in your grandpa's barn. He was grinning the way people grin when they've already decided something is funny. You going to retire on grandpa's trash, Ethan? I didn't say anything. What could I say? You should be planting winter wheat instead of digging around in old concrete, he said, and he meant it as friendly advice. He wasn't a bad man. None of them were bad people. They just couldn't see what I couldn't explain. Tom Raskovich from the co-op said something similar the following week. Miller's out there playing archaeologist while his fences fall down. Word got around. At the diner, at the grain elevator, at the hardware store where I bought bolts and pretended not to hear the conversations that stopped when I walked in. A man in debt who spends his time polishing old signs instead of working. That's not eccentric. That's foolish. That's the kind of thing people remember at your funeral. Poor Ethan. Lost the farm chasing a fairy tale. I almost believed them. That's the worst part. I almost put those signs back in the crate, drove them to Dearborn's, took the $200, and used it to buy seed for a field I couldn't afford to plant. That's how close it was. One more bad conversation, one more look from Sarah, one more letter from the bank, and I would have let it go. But on a cold evening in October, I sat alone in the living room after everyone had gone to bed, and I unwrapped the winter barn scene, the one Josiah called the finest picture he had ever seen, and held it under the lamp. The light hit the porcelain, and something happened. The colors came alive. The snow on the barn roof seemed to glow. The tiny figure of a man walking toward the barn door, barely an inch tall, was so precisely rendered that I could see the slope of his shoulders, the weight of his step. It was not a sign. It was a window into a world that no longer existed, painted by a man who had seen beauty in the same landscape I woke up to every morning. I wrapped it back up carefully, and I posted the photographs online. That night, I took a photograph of 3 of the signs and posted it on an online antiques forum. I didn't expect much. I wrote a short description. Hand-painted porcelain dairy signs, approximately 1904 to 1922, found in a sealed crate under a barn floor in central Iowa, accompanied by a journal documenting their creation. I went to bed. The email arrived at 6:47 the next morning. I almost deleted it, thinking it was spam. The subject line read, "Urgent, porcelain signs, please respond." It was from a woman named Dr. Catherine Marsh. She was an associate curator at the American Folk Art Museum in New York City. Her message was 3 paragraphs long, and her tone was the kind of controlled urgency that people use when they're trying very hard not to sound as excited as they actually are. She asked me where I'd found the signs. She asked if I had any documentation of their provenance, and then she wrote a sentence that made me sit down on the edge of the bed and read it 4 times. If these are genuine works by Abner Hollis, you may be in possession of the most significant discovery in American folk art in the last 50 years. Only 3 authenticated Hollis works are currently known to exist. I didn't know who Abner Hollis was. I mean, I knew the name from Josiah's journal. I knew he was a traveling painter, but I didn't know that sometime after his disappearance in 1923, his work had been rediscovered by art historians. I didn't know that he was now considered one of the most important early American folk artists, a man whose paintings on porcelain and tin were compared to the finest examples of outsider art ever produced on American soil. I didn't know that a single authenticated Hollis sign had sold at auction in 2018 for $1.4 million. I knew none of this. I was a farmer with dirt under his fingernails and a $97,000 debt and a box of signs that Ray Dearborn had, valued at $200. I called Dr. Marsh. What followed was surreal. There is no other word for it. Dr. Marsh flew to Iowa with 2 colleagues. They arrived on a Thursday afternoon in a rented sedan that looked comically out of place parked next to my mud-spattered pickup in the driveway. She was a tall woman in her 50s with silver hair and reading glasses, and when I brought her into the living room and unwrapped the first sign, the Jersey cow in the clover field, she went completely still. She didn't speak for almost 30 seconds. "May I?" she said, and put on a pair of white cotton gloves. She examined each sign for what felt like hours. She read Josiah's journal cover to cover, sitting at my kitchen table while Sarah made coffee and watched from the doorway, with an expression I couldn't quite read. Dr. Marsh's colleagues photographed everything: the signs, the journal, the crate, the cavity in the barn floor, the foundation stones. "Mr. Miller," she said, when they'd finished, "I need to take these to New York for formal authentication, but I want to be honest with you. I've spent 23 years studying Abner Hollis. I know his brushwork, his palette, his compositional habits. These are his. I have no doubt." She paused. "And if the authentication confirms what I already know, this is the largest collection of Hollis works ever discovered, by a significant margin." Sarah set down the coffee pot very carefully and sat down across from me. The authentication took 6 weeks. 6 weeks during which I went about my daily life, feeding cattle, fixing fences, opening envelopes from the bank, while 14 porcelain signs sat in a climate-controlled vault in Manhattan, being studied by some of the foremost experts in American art. It was like living in 2 realities at once. In one, I was a broke farmer, counting the days until foreclosure. In the other, I was the custodian of something priceless. I didn't tell anyone. Not Dale, not Tom, not the guys at the co-op. Sarah and I agreed to keep quiet until we knew for certain. Those 6 weeks were the strangest of my life. I'd be out mending a fence post in 30-degree weather, my fingers numb inside my work gloves, and my phone would buzz with an email from a conservator in New York asking about the mineral content of the soil where the crate had been buried, and I'd stand there in the frozen mud, trying to type a coherent reply with cracked, cold, stiffened hands. 2 worlds, 1 foot in each. Sarah started reading about Abner Hollis. She didn't say anything about it at first, but I noticed tabs open on the family computer, museum websites, auction records, art history articles. One evening, I found her at the kitchen table with Josiah's journal, reading it for the 3rd time, her coffee gone cold beside her. "He was a real artist," she said quietly without looking up. "He wasn't just a sign painter." "No," I said, "he wasn't." She closed the journal and looked at me. "I'm sorry I didn't listen." "You were trying to keep us alive," I said. "There's nothing to be sorry about." The results came back on a Wednesday. All 14 signs were authenticated as genuine works by Abner Hollis, created between 1904 and 1922. The journal was verified as written by Josiah Miller. The provenance was, in Dr. Marsh's words, immaculate, perhaps the most thoroughly documented collection of outsider art in American history. The American Folk Art Museum offered to exhibit the collection. I said yes. The exhibition opened in January, and I won't pretend I wasn't terrified walking into that building in my one good suit, holding Sarah's hand, looking at my great-great-grandfather's dairy signs mounted on white walls under museum lights. The Jersey cow in the clover field had its own wall. The winter barn scene, the one Josiah had called the finest picture I have ever seen, was in the center of the main gallery. People stood in front of it in silence. Sarah squeezed my hand. "I'm sorry I called them junk," she whispered. "They look like junk," I said. "To everybody, that's the whole point." After the exhibition, Christie's handled the sale. I won't describe the auction in detail. It happened in a room full of people who spoke a language I didn't understand, the language of art and money, and value as an abstract concept. I sat in the back row in my good suit and watched numbers climb on a screen. The collection sold for $9.2 million. I'll say that again, because I still have trouble believing it. $9,200,000. For 14 porcelain signs and a leather journal that had spent a century sealed in a brick-lined hole beneath a barn floor in Iowa. Here's what I did with the money. First, I paid off every cent of debt on the farm, the mortgage, the equipment loans, the credit lines, the truck payment, the braces for my son's teeth. All of it. Gone. The day I walked into the bank and handed them a cashier's check for the full amount, the loan officer looked at me like I'd grown a second head. Then I set up a small grant program for struggling family farms in our county, the Miller Hollis Agricultural Fund. It's not a fortune. It won't change the economics of farming, but it gives families a little breathing room when the bad years come, the way someone should have given me breathing room before I nearly lost everything. Last year, we helped 11 farms. This year, we'll help more. I converted the old barn foundation, the same concrete floor where I found the crate, into a community art workshop for rural kids. It's nothing fancy. Concrete floor, new walls, good light, tables made from the reclaimed oak I'd originally planned to sell. We hung a reproduction of the winter barn scene above the door. The original is in a private collection now, somewhere in Connecticut, but the reproduction is good enough. Kids come on Saturdays and paint. Some of them are good. Some of them are terrible. All of them are making something. which is more than most people get a chance to do. Last month, a girl named Lily Perkins, Dale's granddaughter, as it happens, painted a watercolor of her family's grain bins at sunset that made me stop and stare the way Dr. Marsh had stopped and stared at the Jersey cow. The world is full of Abner Hollises, people making beautiful things in quiet places, unseen, unrecognized, working not for fame, but because the thing inside them demands to be made. I believe that now in a way I couldn't have believed it before. And I farm. I still farm. But I do it the way I always wanted to. Small, sustainable, careful. No more gambling on commodity prices. No more borrowing against next year's harvest. I grow what the land wants to grow, and I sell it to people who want to buy it. And at the end of the day, I come inside smelling of dirt and grass instead of desperation. The land is still hard. The weather is still unpredictable. The economics of small farming are still brutal. But I have room now. Room to breathe, room to fail, room to try again. Sometimes I walk out to the old barn foundation in the evening, when the light is the color of warm honey and the fields stretch out in every direction like a quilt someone laid across the earth. I think about Josiah, who saw something beautiful in a traveling painter's work and had the wisdom to protect it. I think about Abner Hollis, who wandered the back roads of the Midwest painting cows and barns and clover fields because that was what he saw and that was what he loved, and who disappeared into history without ever knowing that what he left behind would matter. I think about my grandfather, who inherited the barn and never knew what was under the floor. I think about my father, who farmed this same ground until it stopped his heart. I think about Sarah, who was right about everything except the one thing that mattered most. I think about Dale Perkins calling them Grandpa's trash at the gas station, and Ray Dearborn offering me $200, and how close I came, how terrifyingly close, to tossing those signs in a dumpster and walking away. The things we almost throw away, the things we almost miss, the beauty we step over every day, because it doesn't look like what we expect beauty to look like. My great-great-grandfather buried a masterpiece under a barn floor and trusted that someone, someday, would find it. He waited 100 years. He waited for someone patient enough to look. I don't know if I was patient. I think I was just desperate enough to pay attention to a seam in a concrete floor on a day when I had nothing left to lose. But maybe that's the same thing. Maybe desperation and patience meet somewhere in the middle, in that quiet space where you stop trying to control everything and just start looking, really looking, at what's already in front of you. Real treasure doesn't announce itself. It doesn't shine. It doesn't call your name. It sits in the dark, wrapped in old cloth, buried under concrete, and it waits. It waited for me, and I am grateful every single day that I didn't walk away.